Murder at the Retirement Ball, Chapter 1, The Last Waltz. The first snow of December had dusted Cabot Cove in a powdery white that glimmered beneath the street lamps, lending the small town an almost fairy tale charm. Inside the Civic Centre, however, the air was warm with laughter, music, and the rustle of evening gowns and polished shoes. Tonight was no ordinary gathering. It was the farewell gala for Detective Arthur Jenkins, a man whose very name had become synonymous with the pursuit of justice in the county. I arrived a few minutes before the speeches were due to begin, ushered in by a cheerful doorman who seemed more starstruck by the occasion than the cold outside. The foyer smelled of pine garlands and waxed oak floors. As I handed over my coat, I reminded myself that I wasn't here to pry, investigate, or observe, though I confess old habits die hard. I was here as Arthur's guest, his honoured companion, and as someone who, over the years, had come to count him not just a colleague in crime-solving, but a friend. The ballroom had been transformed with twinkling lights strung across the rafters, golden drapery that caught the glow of chandeliers, and tables laden with delicate china and glassware. A jazz quartet in the corner played a lilting rendition of Blue Moon, coaxing a few brave couples onto the polished dance floor. At the centre of it all stood Detective Jenkins, tall and broad-shouldered despite the advancing years, his presence commanding as ever. He spotted me immediately. "Jessica!" he boomed, his voice carrying above the hum of chatter. Crossing the room with surprising agility for a man of his age, he wrapped me in a firm embrace. "I wouldn't have let them throw this blasted circus without you. After all, how many murderers have we sent away together?" "Too many," I replied, smiling up at him, "but never enough to make the world entirely safe." His laugh rumbled deep in his chest, though his eyes betrayed a shadow of weariness. 40 years of police work had carved lines across his weathered face, but tonight there was something more, a vigilance, as if he were measuring every glance cast in his direction. Before I could ask, we were interrupted by Margaret, his dignified wife, who wore a sapphire dress that matched the gleam of her eyes. "Arthur, the mayor's looking for you." And "Jessica, how wonderful to see you here." We exchanged pleasantries, though I sensed Margaret's hands were tighter around her champagne flute than simple excitement could explain. The evening unfolded in grand fashion. Waiters glided about with trays of hors d'oeuvres, miniature lobster rolls, stuffed mushrooms, and delicate pastries dusted with powdered sugar. The room swelled with familiar faces, officers I had seen at scenes of tragedy, local business owners whose livelihoods Jenkins had once defended, and even a few dignitaries from Augusta who had come to pay their respects. When the speeches began, the orchestra dimmed. The mayor extolled Jenkins's bravery, the chief of police praised his dedication, and fellow officers recalled his tireless mentoring. Arthur, for his part, stood stiffly at the dais, offering a gruff acknowledgement to each speaker. Yet when it came time for his own words, his voice softened. "I never sought praise," he told the crowd, his eyes sweeping the room. "I only sought the truth. And the truth, my friends, is that a badge is only as honourable as the man who wears it. I pray I've worn mine well." The applause that followed was thunderous, though once again I caught a flicker of unease in his expression. His gaze darted to the back of the hall where 3 uniformed officers whispered amongst themselves, their laughter oddly out of place amid the reverence. As the music resumed and couples drifted toward the floor for the first waltz, I allowed myself a rare moment of relaxation. Margaret insisted I join her table, where we chatted about retirement plans, upcoming winter festivals, and even my latest book manuscript. Yet my eyes kept drifting back to Arthur. He moved among the guests with deliberate charm, but every so often his hand brushed against the inside of his jacket, where no doubt his service pistol remained holstered. I had known Arthur long enough to recognize the signs. This was not a man basking in celebration. This was a man bracing himself for something. The string quartet struck up Strauss's Blue Danube, and the dance floor blossomed with swirling gowns and polished shoes. Arthur led Margaret out with surprising grace, twirling her beneath the golden light. For a fleeting instant, the years melted from his face, and the room seemed united in joy. Then it happened. A cry pierced the music. Arthur staggered mid-step, his face contorted in sudden pain. Margaret shrieked as he clutched his chest and fell heavily onto the parquet floor. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. Chairs scraped, glasses shattered. The orchestra faltered into silence. I was already on my feet, pushing past the stunned onlookers. By the time I reached him, a pool of crimson had begun to spread across his white dress shirt. There, protruding cruelly from his ribs, was the hilt of a knife. "Arthur!" I dropped to my knees beside him, grasping his hand. His eyes, once so piercing, now dulled with shock, met mine. His lips trembled, and I leaned close, desperate for words. "Trust no one," he whispered, barely audible above the panicked murmurs. Then his body slackened, and his hand slipped from mine. The room erupted. Officers surged forward to cordon the area, commanding civilians to step back. Margaret collapsed in sobs, restrained by 2 attendants. Chief Avery barked orders, his voice thick with fury and disbelief. I remained kneeling beside Arthur, numb, my heart hammering with grief and confusion. I had witnessed death before, too often in fact, but never like this, never so public, never so calculated. This was no crime of passion, this was a message. I forced myself to stand, brushing blood from my palms, my mind already racing. Someone had brought a knife into a ballroom filled with police officers and officials. Someone had timed their strike to coincide with the music and the crowd's distraction. And someone had silenced one of the most respected detectives Cabot Cove had ever known. As I looked across the sea of faces, some pale with shock, others suspiciously impassive, I realized that Arthur's dying words were not the ramblings of a man fading from this world. They were a warning. Somewhere in this room stood his killer, cloaked in authority or friendship, hiding behind a badge or a smile. And I, Jessica Fletcher, had just been handed a mystery I could not refuse. Chapter 2. The Case Files. The morning after the gala dawned grey and sombre, a sharp contrast to the glitz of the night before. Cabot Cove's usually tranquil streets seemed weighed down by grief. Newspaper boys called out headlines that made my stomach clench. Detective Jenkins slain at retirement ball. Though the town was no stranger to tragedy, this loss carried a heavier burden. Arthur Jenkins had been more than an officer. He had been a symbol of order, a man who embodied the law. I spent the early hours pacing in my sitting room, replaying every detail of the previous night. The music, the speeches, the flicker of unease in Arthur's eyes, and most of all, his final whispered words, "Trust no one." They echoed in my mind like a refrain, impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, I received a call from Chief Avery. His voice was clipped, each word taut with the strain of trying to control what had spiraled out of hand. "Jessica, I know this is a lot to ask, but we need your eyes on this. Jenkins respected you, and frankly, he'd want you involved. Will you come down to the station?" I agreed, though not without hesitation. It was never easy walking into a police investigation where emotions ran high and suspicion could be cast in every direction. Still, I knew I owed it to Arthur. The Cabot Cove Police Department was hushed when I arrived, the usual bustle replaced by a heavy silence. Officers moved with subdued purpose, their conversations brief, their expressions grim. Chief Avery met me at the door to his office, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I shouldn't even be showing you this," he muttered, as he closed the door behind us. "But Jenkins trusted you, and at this point I'm running out of people I can trust myself." On his desk lay a stack of folders, neatly arranged in the meticulous style that could only belong to Arthur. The sight of them sent a pang through me. Even in death, or what appeared to be death, his presence filled the room. "These were found in his private study last night," Avery explained. Margaret handed them over. "She said Arthur had been poring over them in recent weeks. Thought you might see something we're missing." I slid into the chair opposite and pulled the top folder toward me. Inside were notes in Arthur's strong, deliberate handwriting. Reports of missing evidence, tip-offs gone awry, and cases that had collapsed under suspicious circumstances. A theme began to emerge as I leafed through page after page. Corruption. Arthur had suspected a mole within the department. It was not a casual suspicion, but one he had carefully documented. Names appeared in his notes, officers who had been present when raids failed, men and women who had access to sensitive information. His suspicions weren't limited to low-ranking officers either. A few notes pointed higher up the chain, suggesting the betrayal reached into senior leadership. As I sifted further, my fingers brushed against a sealed envelope marked in block letters. For Jessica. My breath caught. I looked at Avery, who nodded grimly. "It was in the pile when Margaret gave me the box. I thought you should be the one to open it." I tore it open carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter dated only 2 days prior. "Jessica," it began, "if you are reading this, then events have moved beyond my control. I have reason to believe that someone within this department has been feeding information to our enemies. I can no longer trust those around me, and I fear that my life is in danger. If something happens to me, you must carry this forward. Follow the pattern in these files. They will lead you to the truth. But be cautious. The mole is clever and closer than you imagine." The words struck like a hammer. Arthur had known. His death was no random act of violence. It was the culmination of weeks, perhaps months, of unease. I placed the letter on the desk, my mind already racing. If Arthur had anticipated his own demise, had he also prepared for it? Had he left behind more than just suspicions? Among the folders, one in particular stood out. It was slimmer than the others, its label handwritten, Operation Harborside. I recognized the name immediately. Months earlier, the Cabot Cove PD had announced the successful dismantling of a smuggling ring that had plagued the coast. According to the official press release, contraband had been seized, arrests made, and the case closed. But Arthur's notes told a different story. "The ring continues," I read aloud, tracing the underlined words. "Evidence of inside tip-offs, suspect collaboration from within department, closure of case premature, likely deliberate." Avery leaned forward, frowning. "He never told me any of this." "Perhaps he couldn't," I suggested. If he suspected the mole was embedded deeply, he might have feared the information wouldn't reach clean ears. Avery exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. "So, you think the murder's tied to this?" "I think," I replied carefully, "that Arthur Jenkins didn't just stumble into danger. He was hunting it, and whoever he was circling knew it." I spent the next hour cross-referencing names mentioned in Arthur's notes with those present at the ball. It was a chilling exercise. Several of the officers flagged in his files had stood in that very room last night, raising glasses in his honor. Sergeant Ramos, implicated in a failed raid 2 years ago, Officer Donnelly, whose reports had consistently gone missing, Lieutenant Harker, whose meteoric rise had raised more than a few eyebrows. Each had been present, their expressions masked by grief or guilt. As I pieced the fragments together, a strange sensation washed over me. Arthur's death, so shocking and so public, had been almost theatrical. Too theatrical. The knife, the collapse, the whispered warning, it all carried the air of performance. A dangerous thought flickered across my mind. What if Arthur hadn't truly died? What if the man I had seen collapse on the dance floor had staged his own demise, using the chaos to vanish and continue his pursuit from the shadows? I pushed the thought aside as quickly as it came. Margaret's tears had been real, the blood on my hands warm and heavy. And yet the possibility lingered, refusing to be dismissed entirely. When I finally left the station, the sky had grown darker, heavy with snow. I clutched Arthur's letter against my chest, my resolve hardening. Whatever secrets lay hidden within those files, I would uncover them. For Arthur, for Margaret, and for the truth. Chapter 3. Whispers at the Wake. The following day brought with it a strange stillness, as though the entire town were holding its breath. Flags outside the municipal buildings fluttered at half-mast, and black ribbons adorned the lampposts along Main Street. The death, or apparent death, of Arthur Jenkins had not just left a personal void, but had struck at the heart of Cabot Cove's sense of safety. The wake was held at St. Andrew's Church, a stone edifice that had seen its fair share of both joy and sorrow over the years. Its bell tolled mournfully as mourners trickled in, their hushed conversations merging into a low hum that seemed to reverberate against the high-vaulted ceiling. Inside, the air was perfumed with lilies, chrysanthemums, and the faint smell of polished pews. I had attended many such gatherings in my time, yet there was something palpably different about this one. The grief was genuine, but underneath it lingered unease, as though the mourners sensed there was more to this story than the tragedy of a good man struck down. Margaret Jenkins sat at the front, a black veil partially concealing her face. She clutched a handkerchief in one hand and a rosary in the other, her knuckles pale from the grip. Every so often her shoulders trembled as waves of grief passed through her. It was difficult to watch, knowing what Arthur's final note to me had implied, that his death had not been the work of fate but the culmination of a deliberate betrayal. From my seat halfway down the aisle, I allowed my gaze to wander. Officer Donnelly was among the first to draw my attention. He sat rigidly, eyes fixed on the coffin, but his hands trembled in his lap. Not the soft, trembling grief of a man mourning a mentor, but the nervous twitch of someone waiting for an axe to fall. Nearby, Sergeant Ramos avoided meeting anyone's eyes, staring instead at the hymn book clutched tightly in his hands. His lips moved silently, though I doubted he was reciting prayers. Then there was Lieutenant Harker. He had chosen a seat further back, his posture perfectly composed, his expression solemn but detached, as though he were playing a part in a drama rather than living through it. When our eyes briefly met, his smile was faint, courteous, yet it carried no warmth. The service began with the usual prayers and hymns, voices rising in a collective lament that filled the cavernous space, yet I could not shake the feeling that every note of music was drowned by Arthur's last words to me: trust no one. After the service, mourners gathered in the church hall for refreshments. Platters of sandwiches and teapots were laid out, but few had the appetite to partake. Conversations drifted in hushed tones, fragments of speculation reaching my ears. Or he knew too much, that's what they say. Or retirement was just an excuse, he'd made enemies. No, someone in uniform, mark my words. I moved discreetly among the groups, my notebook tucked into my handbag. While most assumed my presence was simply as Arthur's friend, I could not resist my role as an observer. I caught sight of Donnelly speaking in hurried whispers to a young officer. Their conversation ceased abruptly when I approached, replaced by stiff pleasantries. Ramos, too, seemed eager to slip away, excusing himself from every group he entered. It was during a lull that Margaret approached me. Her veil lifted slightly as she leaned close, her voice a tremulous whisper. "Jessica, he knew something. Arthur told me, just days ago, that if anything happened, I was to place my trust in you." Her eyes glistened. "He carried secrets he didn't share, even with me. Please, find the truth." I squeezed her hand gently. "I promise you, Margaret, I will." The words were simple, but as I spoke them, I felt the full weight of the responsibility Arthur had left behind. Later that evening, I returned to my inn, determined to review the files once more. I spread them across the small writing desk, arranging them in the same pattern Arthur had left. At first glance, they seemed to be nothing more than scattered case notes. But as I traced the connections, a clearer picture began to form. Every failed raid, every missing piece of evidence, every collapsed case, it all circled back to Operation Harbourside. The smuggling ring had supposedly been dismantled, yet according to Arthur's notes, it remained very much alive. More troubling still, he had written cryptic annotations in the margins. Inside leak confirmed, watch Donnelly, higher involvement suspected, H. The initials leapt out at me. H, could it truly be Harker? His composed demeanour at the wake, his faint, practiced smile, it all seemed consistent with a man hiding something, but Arthur had always been cautious in his notes, never committing outright accusations to paper. The ambiguity left me torn between suspicion and certainty. I was still studying when a noise outside drew my attention, the faint crunch of footsteps on the frosted ground. I rose and peered through the lace curtains. A figure in a long coat lingered at the corner of the street lamp's glow. For a moment I thought it might be an officer on patrol, but the figure remained too still, watching the inn with unsettling focus. When I opened the door and stepped into the cold night air, the figure slipped into the shadows and disappeared. No name, no face, just the echo of boots retreating into the dark. I closed the door firmly behind me, shivering, not from the cold, but from the realization that I was now being watched. Whether by friend or foe, I could not tell. But one thing was certain. Arthur's death had set a chain of events into motion, and those responsible were already aware that I was following the trail. I sat down again at the desk, my pen poised above the paper, and wrote only 3 words. The game begins. Chapter 4. A Dance of Lies. The morning after the wake, Cabot Cove returned to its daily rhythms, though beneath the surface a current of unease still rippled. The bakery opened its doors, fishermen hauled their catches to the docks, children trudged to school with scarves wrapped tight, yet the conversations that floated above the hum of ordinary life always circled back to the same question. Who would dare kill Arthur Jenkins? For me, the question was larger. I had begun to suspect that Arthur had not been killed at all, but rather had orchestrated his apparent demise. It was a dangerous thought to carry, one that would have earned disbelief from nearly anyone else. But I had seen his careful planning in the files, heard his warnings in the letter he left, and felt the deliberate rhythm behind the so-called tragedy. If I wanted answers, I needed to revisit the scene of his supposed death, the Civic Center ballroom. When I arrived, the janitor, Mr. Callahan, was sweeping the parquet floor, his broom scraping softly against the wood. The decorations had been stripped down, the music stands folded away, leaving only the echo of celebration in the cavernous space. "Morning, Mrs. Fletcher," he greeted me with a sad smile. Can't believe what happened here. Still feels wrong to polish up the very spot he fell. I understand, I said gently, my eyes scanning the floor. Tell me, did anyone linger here after the crowd left? Callahan shook his head. Police cleared the place fast. But... He hesitated, lowering his voice. I did notice one of the evidence bags wasn't logged properly. Knife handle was sealed, but the blade itself, well, it didn't look fresh, almost as though it had been stored for years. That confirmed what I had already suspected. The murder weapon had been recycled from old evidence, perhaps pulled from the archives of the Harbourside case. Such a choice wasn't accidental. It was symbolic, even theatrical, designed to point back to the very case Arthur had been working in secret. I paced the room slowly, replaying the night in my mind. Music swelling, Arthur dancing, the sudden collapse. If his death had been staged, he would have needed assistance. Someone to plant the blade, someone to create the illusion of blood, someone he could trust with his life. But who could that be when his final words to me were to trust no one? As I stood beneath the chandelier, my thoughts were interrupted by Chief Avery's arrival. His heavy boots echoed across the floor, his expression taut with irritation. Jessica, you shouldn't be here without clearance. Arthur left me his files, I reminded him calmly. If you want answers, we need to consider possibilities that go beyond the obvious. His jaw tightened. Such as? That Jenkins may not be dead at all. The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Avery stared at me, disbelief warring with something else. Fear, perhaps. You're suggesting he staged the entire thing? In front of 100 witnesses? Yes, I replied. Because only by disappearing could he force the mole's hand. Look at the knife. It wasn't new. Look at the positioning. It was too perfect, too dramatic. And his last words to me were not of farewell, but of caution. Avery rubbed his temples. If you're right, then he's alive somewhere. But that also means we're being played, and I don't take kindly to being manipulated. Before I could answer, a sound interrupted us, the faint flutter of paper. I looked down to see a small envelope lying beneath one of the tables. It must have slipped through the cracks during cleanup. I bent to retrieve it. The envelope bore no name, only a single red circle drawn on the front. Inside was a photograph from the night of the ball. Arthur, mid-dance, smiling. The circle, drawn in the same ink, highlighted not Arthur, but the shadowy figure of Lieutenant Harker standing at the edge of the floor. On the back, 3 words were scrawled in hurried script. Keep looking deeper. I handed the photo to Avery, his face hardened. If this is Jenkins's doing, he's baiting us. If it's not, then someone else is pulling strings. Later that afternoon, I visited the police archives, a dimly lit basement lined with filing cabinets that smelled of dust and metal. The evidence clerk, Mrs. Boyd, recognized me immediately and, after some persuasion, allowed me to review the logs. The knife from the ball had indeed been logged years ago under Operation Harbourside, but something caught my attention. Its chain of custody ended abruptly after Jenkins signed it out for review 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. Long enough for him to plan, long enough for him to stage. As I turned the brittle pages, I heard the faint creak of the archive door behind me. Startled, I looked up. A uniformed officer stood in the doorway. Officer Donnelly. His face was pale, his voice strained. "Mrs. Fletcher, you shouldn't be down here alone. Dangerous things get lost in places like this." I met his gaze evenly. "Or found." He shifted uneasily, then muttered something about needing to check the upstairs desk and vanished as quickly as he had come. I exhaled slowly. His nerves betrayed him more than any file ever could. That evening, back at my inn, I laid out the files once more, this time adding the photograph. The pieces were aligning into a picture that was still incomplete, but one thing was certain. Someone wanted me to keep digging. Whether that someone was Arthur himself or another hand guiding events, I could not yet be sure. As the clock struck midnight, I pushed back from the desk and gazed out the window. Snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the streets in silence. Yet beneath that silence, I could sense the pulse of danger. Every move I made was being watched. Every clue I uncovered nudged into my path by someone unseen. Arthur had called it a mole. I called it a dance of lies. And the music had only just begun. Chapter 5. The Secret Safe. The next morning brought a bitter wind that rattled the shutters of my inn room, a reminder that winter had fully claimed Cabot Cove. I dressed quickly, my mind still circling. The photograph slipped beneath the ballroom table. Who had left it there, and why highlight Lieutenant Harker? Was it a warning, or a breadcrumb placed deliberately to keep me chasing shadows? I resolved that if answers were to be found, they would not come from speculation alone. Arthur's notes, his letter, and the pattern in his files suggested he had hidden more than what I had uncovered. A man as methodical as Jenkins would never rely solely on loose papers. He would have secured the most damning pieces elsewhere, somewhere beyond the reach of the mole. That thought guided me to the police station once again. I walked through its doors with the familiarity of one who had spent far too many hours in such places. The atmosphere remained tense, officers moving with clipped efficiency, their conversations guarded. Grief had given way to suspicion. Chief Avery greeted me in his office, though the deep lines on his face showed little enthusiasm. "Jessica, you can't keep stirring the pot without proof. Every time you whisper about a mole, half the department thinks you're pointing at them." "Perhaps that's the point," I replied. "Guilt unsettles those who carry it." He sighed. "What do you think you'll find today?" "Something Jenkins didn't want in plain sight," I said. "Where did he keep his personal effects here?" "Beyond his desk." Avery hesitated. "There's a storage office upstairs, his commendations, old case journals, that sort of thing. But we've already looked. Humour me." The room upstairs was lined with shelves of boxed evidence, commendation plaques, and forgotten files. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light from the narrow windows. I moved carefully, scanning the rows until I reached a section dedicated to Jenkins. His framed certificates rested against one wall, along with a glass display case holding his service revolver and badge. But it was the wall behind that drew my attention. Something about the arrangement of commendations seemed too deliberate. I touched one of the frames. It shifted slightly, as though it had been placed to conceal rather than decorate. Behind it, a faint outline broke the uniform plaster. "A safe," I whispered. Avery joined me, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't authorize this." "Of course not," I said. "Arthur wouldn't have wanted anyone to know." With Avery's reluctant permission, a locksmith was summoned. It took nearly an hour of delicate manipulation before the door swung open with a metallic sigh. Inside was not money or trinkets, but precisely what I expected. Evidence Jenkins had hidden from prying eyes. The first item was a small reel-to-reel tape recorder. My pulse quickened as I threaded the tape and pressed play. Arthur's voice filled the room, firm and steady. "These notes are for Jessica Fletcher. If you are hearing this, I have been forced into hiding. My death, if it appears so, is not final. It is the only way to flush out the traitor in our ranks. Trust no one, Jessica, not even those who claim loyalty. The mole has reach and resources. But know this. I have traced the betrayal to a pattern of payments carefully disguised, leading to one senior officer. Follow the trail to the Cabot Cove Bank. There you will find the ledger. I froze, the words confirming every suspicion. Arthur was alive. He had faked his death with calculated precision, and he had left me the next step. The safe contained more. Photographs of seized contraband from Operation Harbourside, all marked with Arthur's annotations. In each photo, an officer stood in the background, sometimes Donnelly, sometimes Ramos, but often, almost too often, Lieutenant Harker. The repetition was glaring. There was also a map of the Cabot Cove waterfront, marked with circles and arrows. The smuggling routes Arthur had traced all converged on a single warehouse near the pier. Scrawled across the margin, drop point compromised, internal leak confirmed. As I examined the contents, Avery leaned heavily against the wall. You realize what this means. Jenkins has been running a secret investigation behind my back. He staged his death, left you clues, and now we're chasing phantoms while the department tears itself apart. He did it, I said firmly, because he couldn't risk the mole catching wind of his suspicions. He needed to disappear so the traitor would expose themselves, and if we don't act, the trail will vanish along with him. We agreed to keep the discovery quiet for now. If the mole suspected we had found Arthur's recordings, they would tighten their guard. That afternoon, I walked to the Cabot Cove Bank. The cold bit through my coat, but determination carried me forward. Inside, the bank smelled of polished wood and ink, its marble counters gleaming. I requested access to Arthur Jenkins's safety deposit box, presenting the letter he had addressed to me. After some hesitation, the manager obliged. Inside the box lay a leather-bound ledger, heavy and worn. Its pages were filled with columns of coded entries, initials and sums of money recorded over years. As I scanned the pages, a chill ran through me. The initials LH appeared repeatedly, always tied to large deposits made days before failed police raids or botched arrests. Lieutenant Harker. But before I could study further, the sound of tires screeching outside made me glance toward the frosted glass windows. A dark sedan idled at the curb, its engine humming. I caught only a glimpse of the driver before the car sped away, but the message was clear. My movements were being watched. I tucked the ledger securely into my bag and thanked the manager with as much composure as I could muster. My heart, however, beat furiously. If the mole knew I had this book, then I had become more than an observer. I had become the next target. That evening, back in the safety of my room, I spread the ledger beside the contents from the safe. The connections were undeniable. The payments, the photographs, the map, all pointed to one conclusion. Arthur had been on the verge of unmasking Lieutenant Harker. But the larger question loomed. If Arthur was alive, where was he hiding? And how long could he remain in the shadows before the mole turned the hunt upon him? As I extinguished the lamp and sat in the quiet darkness, I felt both closer and farther from the truth. The pieces were aligning, yet the picture remained incomplete. All I knew for certain was that Arthur's gamble had placed us both in peril, and the dance of deception was nearing its crescendo. Chapter 6. Ledger of Betrayal. The leather-bound ledger weighed heavily in my hands as though it carried not just numbers and initials, but the gravity of betrayal itself. By lamplight, I examined each page carefully, tracing the coded entries that Arthur had risked everything to conceal. The repetition of LH left little to the imagination. Lieutenant Harker had been receiving substantial sums of money, amounts far beyond what any honest officer could justify, each coinciding with compromised raids, missing evidence, or smugglers who slipped miraculously through the cracks. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Arthur had documented everything with meticulous care. Yet my discovery also placed me in the crosshairs of whoever had financed Harker's duplicity. And judging by the sedan that had lingered outside the bank, they already knew I had the book. I made several copies of the key pages using the small portable copier at the inn's front desk. One set for me, one to be hidden elsewhere, and another to deliver to Chief Avery. If I were silenced, at least the truth would not vanish with me. The next morning, I carried the copies to Avery's office. He read them slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "This ledger is damning, Jessica. If it holds up in court, Harker's finished. But bringing him in won't be simple. He's respected, charismatic, and still commands loyalty from half the force." "Which makes him all the more dangerous," I replied. "Arthur knew that. That's why he staged his own death. It was the only way to provoke a mistake." Avery leaned back, his eyes clouded. "If Jenkins is alive, why hasn't he come forward? Why leave us to unravel this? Because stepping into the light would make him the mole's first target. As long as the traitor believes Jenkins is dead, Arthur can continue his investigation unseen." Our conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor. Officer Donnelly stormed in, face flushed. "Chief, there's been another break-in at the evidence lockup. Files from Operation Harborside are gone." His eyes flicked nervously toward me before darting away. "Gone?" Avery barked. "Every report, every photo," Donnelly stammered. "The lock was forced sometime last night." I exchanged a glance with Avery. Whoever had stolen the files knew we were closing in. The ledger was now the only surviving record of Harker's transactions. Later that afternoon, I carried the ledger with me to the library, hoping for quiet as I worked to decode additional initials. Most entries were vague, but a few connected to known smugglers' aliases, confirmation that the payments were tied to criminal operations. Still, one set of initials troubled me. RM. They appeared sporadically, linked to smaller sums, yet their presence nagged at me. As I sat pondering, the silence was broken by the soft scrape of a chair nearby. I looked up to find Sergeant Ramos standing across the table. His expression was tense, his voice low. "Mrs. Fletcher, you should stop digging. Jenkins's death was tragedy enough. Don't make yourself another casualty." I closed the ledger calmly. "Why does the truth trouble you so, Sergeant?" He shifted uneasily. "Because truth cuts both ways. Not everyone you think is guilty wears the mask you expect." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. By the time I left the library, evening had descended and the streets were eerily quiet. Snowflakes swirled under the street lamps, muting every sound. As I crossed the square, the growl of an engine made me pause. The same dark sedan I had glimpsed outside the bank rolled into view, its headlights flared, blinding me for a moment. Then the passenger window slid down and the glint of a firearm appeared. Instinct took over. I darted behind the stone wall of the post office as a shot rang out, splintering brick where I had stood seconds before. The car sped away, its tires skidding across the icy road, leaving only silence in its wake. Shaken but unhurt, I hurried back to the inn. My hands trembled as I locked the door behind me. Someone wanted me silenced, and the timing left little doubt. It was the ledger they feared. I sat at the desk, forcing myself to steady my breathing. Fear would accomplish nothing. Methodical reasoning, however, might. I spread the ledger's pages once more and began cross-referencing the payments with Arthur's map of the waterfront. The dates of LH deposits aligned perfectly with shipments arriving at the pier. Each time, law enforcement raids had been delayed or redirected. Smugglers had escaped clean. The financial trail was irrefutable, but the entries for RM puzzled me further. Could they be Ramos's initials? Or someone else entirely? Perhaps even a civilian accomplice? The smaller sums suggested a lesser role, but complicity nonetheless. As I worked, a knock at the door startled me. My heart pounded as I approached cautiously. To my relief, it was Chief Avery. He stepped inside quickly, shutting the cold out behind him. "I heard about the shooting," he said grimly. "You're lucky to be alive." "Luck had little to do with it," I replied. "Someone is escalating." "The ledger terrifies them," Avery sat heavily. "Then we move fast. Tomorrow night, the board meets to discuss next steps. Bring the ledger. If Jenkins is alive, maybe he'll reveal himself then. If not, we'll confront Harker with what we have." I nodded, though unease gnawed at me. Confronting Harker without Arthur present felt like stepping into a trap. Yet delay was no longer an option. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the inn felt magnified, every gust of wind against the shutters a warning. I thought of Arthur, somewhere in hiding, relying on me to complete the puzzle he had begun. I thought of Margaret, mourning a husband who might yet live, and I thought of the bullet that had nearly found its mark, a reminder that my time was running short. By dawn, my decision was clear. The ledger would be my shield and my weapon. At the board meeting, the truth would surface, whether through quiet confession or explosive revelation. As I packed the evidence carefully into my satchel, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The lines of worry etched across my face mirrored the determination in my eyes. I had stepped unwillingly into Arthur's final case, but I would see it through, for justice, for Cabot Cove, for the friend who had trusted me above all others. Chapter 7. The Return of the Dead. The night of the board meeting arrived with a brittle cold that gnawed through every layer of clothing. The town hall, usually a place of mundane civic discussions, had been transformed into a fortress of tension. Officers lined the walls, their faces rigid, their eyes darting as though each wondered who among them might be guilty. The air smelled faintly of damp wool, ink, and nerves. I clutched my satchel close, the ledger hidden within, and took a seat near the front. Chief Avery stood at the head of the long oak table, his broad shoulders weighed down by the burden of leadership. Across from him, Lieutenant Harker entered with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He removed his gloves slowly, almost theatrically, before settling into his chair. The meeting began with formalities, minutes read, condolences offered, but the undercurrent of suspicion made every word heavy. When Avery finally gestured to me, the room stilled. "Mrs. Fletcher has evidence," he said gravely, "that may shed light on Detective Jenkins's death." I rose, placing the ledger carefully on the table. This book was discovered in Arthur's safety deposit box. It details a series of financial transactions coded by initials. The most frequent entry, LH, coincides precisely with failed raids and missing evidence from Operation Harbourside. A murmur rippled through the room. Harker leaned back, his smile faint. Are we truly putting stock in scribbles from a dead man's journal? Anyone could have written those initials. Perhaps even Mrs. Fletcher herself. I ignored the barb and turned another page. The ledger is corroborated by Arthur's private notes, photographs, and maps. This is not conjecture. This is a trail, one that leads to betrayal. Before Harker could respond, the double doors at the back of the hall creaked open. Gasps filled the room. There, framed in the dim light of the corridor, stood Arthur Jenkins. Alive. His presence was spectral, yet solid, the lines of his face drawn tighter, his figure thinner, but unmistakably real. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from Margaret, who had insisted on attending despite her grief. She rose, her hands trembling. "Arthur!" He raised a hand, steady, commanding. "Stay seated, Margaret. Tonight is not for reunions. Tonight is for truth." The room erupted into a storm of whispers. Some officers stood in shock, others recoiled as though confronted by an apparition. Harker, however, paled for the first time, his composure slipping. Arthur strode forward, each step measured, his boots echoing across the floor. "I faked my death," he said, his voice carrying with authority. "I did it because I could no longer expose the traitor while alive. Too many eyes watched me, too many ears listened. Only in death could I be free to continue the hunt." He reached the table and placed a worn tape recorder beside the ledger. "I recorded everything, the bribes, the patterns, the names, and now the final piece is ready to fall into place." Harker pushed back his chair, rising with a sharp scrape of wood against stone. "This is absurd. A cheap performance staged to humiliate me. Do you have proof, Jenkins, or merely paranoia?" Arthur's gaze was steady. "Proof enough to end your career and your freedom. The knife used at the gala, the blade you planted in my vest, was logged under your custody years ago. Forensics will find your print still on the hilt. You thought reusing old evidence would divert suspicion, but it did the opposite. It tied you directly to both crimes." Harker's fists clenched. "You can't prove I touched that knife recently." That was my cue. I stepped forward, holding up the photograph I had found beneath the ballroom table. "You were seen near the evidence lockers just days before the gala." Someone wanted me to notice, perhaps Arthur himself, perhaps another watchful eye. Either way, your shadow fell where it shouldn't. The room stirred with anger, betrayal, disbelief. Officers shifted in their seats, some muttering, others glaring at Harker with dawning comprehension. Harker's mask cracked. His voice rose, sharp and venomous. "You think you've cornered me? You're fools, all of you. Do you know how many criminals you've walked into thanks to me? I kept this department afloat with the money I funneled. Without me, half your raids would have starved the town of resources." "Blood money," Arthur growled, "bought at the price of loyalty, justice, and lives lost." For a moment, chaos threatened to erupt. Officers surged forward, some shouting, some trying to restrain others. Chief Avery banged his gavel, his voice booming. "Enough! Lieutenant Harker, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and attempted murder." But Harker was not finished. He reached into his coat, and the glint of steel flashed. A collective gasp filled the hall as he drew a small revolver, his hand steady despite the storm around him. Margaret screamed. Officers dove for cover. Yet before Harker could raise the weapon, Arthur stepped forward, his stance unwavering. "Don't do this, Lionel. Drop it. End this farce with a shred of dignity." For a heartbeat, time seemed suspended. Harker's eyes darted from Arthur to me, to the officers surrounding him. Then, with a bitter laugh, he slammed the revolver onto the table and raised his hands. "Fine," he sneered. "Take me. But remember this, every man in this room benefited from what I built. You'll hang me, but the rot runs deeper than you know." His words lingered as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. As Harker was led away, Arthur sagged slightly, the weight of months in hiding finally visible. Margaret rushed to his side, tears streaming, but he held her gently, his eyes still fixed on the departing traitor. When calm returned, Arthur turned to me. "Jessica, without you, this would never have come to light. You followed the trail when I could not. You brought me back from the shadows." I shook my head. "You left me the clues, Arthur. I only did what you trusted me to do, see them through." The hall emptied slowly, the officers subdued, the townsfolk shaken. Yet beneath the lingering tension, a sense of catharsis settled. The ghost had returned, the traitor unmasked. But Harker's final words troubled me. If the rot ran deeper, then tonight's battle was only the beginning. And in Cabot Cove, beginnings always had a way of leading to more mysteries. Chapter 8. The Final Waltz. The arrest of Lieutenant Lionel Harker reverberated through Cabot Cove like the toll of a church bell. For days, whispers filled the streets, mingling with the crunch of boots on snow. People spoke in hushed tones at the diner, behind counters at the hardware store, and even along the docks where fishermen gathered before dawn. Some expressed disbelief. How could such a respected officer have betrayed them? Others admitted that perhaps they had seen hints of arrogance, of ambition too sharp to be honest. For Arthur Jenkins, the revelation was both vindication and burden. Though alive, he carried the scars of months spent in hiding, of deceit practiced against those who loved him most. His reappearance had saved the department from rot, yet it had also fractured trust in ways that would take years to mend. I met him a few mornings later at the Civic Center, where workers were dismantling the last of the gala decorations. The parquet floor had been polished, the chandeliers cleaned, as though the place were eager to shed the memory of betrayal. Arthur stood at the window, gazing across the snow-dusted square, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "Strange," he murmured, "to stand where I pretended to fall. Feels like I've been haunting my own life," I joined him quietly. "Haunting or not, you achieved what you set out to do. The mole is unmasked. The department can breathe again." He turned, his expression weary. "At what cost, Jessica?" Margaret mourned me as dead. My colleagues buried me in their hearts. I let them believe it, all for the sake of catching one man. "Not just one man," I reminded him gently. "You exposed a network of corruption. Without your deception, it might have thrived for years." Arthur sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Sometimes justice demands more than I wish to give, but I'll accept the burden if it means Cabot Cove is safer." That evening, Chief Avery convened a press conference. The ledger, Arthur's tapes, and the recovered evidence were presented. Reporters scribbled furiously as Avery announced Harker's formal charges: conspiracy, corruption, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. The crowd's questions were relentless, yet Avery held firm, his tone steady. Detective Jenkins risked everything to reveal the truth. Though his methods were unconventional, his dedication to justice remains unshaken. Margaret stood beside Arthur throughout, her hand clasping his tightly. The veil of grief had lifted from her eyes, replaced by something fiercer, a mixture of relief, pride, and lingering hurt. Afterward, she confided in me, her voice hushed. "I don't know whether to embrace him or scold him for putting me through hell." "Do both," I suggested with a smile. "He deserves each in equal measure." The trial moved swiftly. Evidence piled high against Harker, bolstered by testimonies from smugglers who, once promised leniency, described the bribes and inside tips. He attempted to cast doubt, to smear Arthur's reputation, even to insinuate that I had fabricated the ledger. Yet the weight of proof was too heavy, the pattern too precise. Within weeks, the jury found him guilty on all counts. Still, Harker's final words haunted me. "The rot runs deeper than you know." Was it bluster, the last defiance of a man cornered? Or was it a veiled warning that more shadows lingered within the force? Only time would tell. In the days that followed, the town tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The church bells rang again for Sunday service. The market bustled with shoppers hunting for holiday gifts. Children built snowmen in the square, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. Yet an undercurrent remained, a collective reminder that even trusted guardians could falter. Arthur, for his part, announced that his retirement would stand. "I've danced long enough," he told the town at a modest gathering in the civic centre, where no banners or quartets marked the occasion, only sincere applause. "My work is done. It's time to hand the floor to others." The applause swelled, mingling relief with respect. Margaret kissed his cheek, her forgiveness silent but evident. For the first time in months, Arthur's shoulders seemed lighter. As for me, I returned to my writing desk in my cosy Cabot Cove home. The case lingered in my thoughts, demanding reflection before it could become mere memory. I jotted notes in my journal, the staged death, the ledger, the mole's downfall, but what struck me most was not the treachery uncovered, but the resilience of truth. That night I attended one final gathering at the Civic Centre. The town had insisted on hosting a modest winter ball, not to celebrate Arthur this time, but to reclaim the space that betrayal had stolen. The quartet played, couples swirled across the floor, and laughter rose once again to the chandeliers. Arthur approached me as the music shifted to Strauss. "Care to dance, Jessica?" I chuckled. "Arthur, you know my two left feet." "Then let me lead," he said, with a grin. And so we stepped onto the floor. The room spun with colour and motion, the echoes of past tragedy softened by the present joy. For a moment I saw the man not as detective or deceiver, but simply as a friend who had given everything to protect his town. As the music swelled, I thought of the irony that it was a waltz that had marked his false death, and now another that marked his true return. Perhaps that was fitting. Life, like a dance, is full of missteps, turns, and unexpected partners, yet in the end it finds its rhythm again. When the final notes faded, applause erupted. Arthur bowed gallantly, Margaret beamed, and I felt a quiet peace settle in my heart. Later, as I walked home beneath the silver glow of moonlight on snow, I reflected once more on Arthur's whispered words that night at the ball. "Trust no one." I smiled faintly. Trust, I had learned, must be tested, sometimes broken but always pursued. Without it, justice falters. With it, even betrayal can be unmasked. And so ended the mystery of the retirement ball. Cabot Cove would sleep easier now, though somewhere beyond the horizon, I knew another puzzle waited. They always did. For in my world, the final waltz is never truly final.